This paper is titled Investigating the Design of Augmented Narrative Spaces Through Virtual Real Connections, a Systematic Literature Review. It is a collaborative work conducted by Jae-eun Shin, Hayun Kim, HYERIM Park, and Woontack Woo. Augmented reality is regarded as an innovative storytelling medium that presents novel experiences by layering a virtual narrative space over a real 3D space. However, understanding of how the virtual narrative space and the real space are connected with one another in the design of augmented narrative spaces has been limited. For this, we conducted a systematic literature review of 64 articles featuring AR storytelling applications and systems in HCI, AR, and MR research. We investigated how virtual narrative spaces have been paired, functionalized, placed, and registered in relation to the real spaces they target. Based on these connections, we identified 8 dominant types of augmented narrative spaces that are primarily categorized by whether they virtually narrativize reality or realize the virtual narrative. We discuss our findings to propose design recommendations on how virtual real connections can be incorporated into a more structured approach to AR storytelling. Augmented reality is a spatial storytelling medium that transcends limitations of conventional media by providing a unique combination of both spatial and narrative characteristics. With AR, a virtual narrative space is layered over a real 3D space, thereby forming an augmented narrative space. The virtual narrative space and the real space are connected through various dimensions, and the features of the two spaces comprising augmented narrative space also determine how mutual relationships between them create effective narrative experiences. Connections between the virtual and the real have mainly been discussed with attention to the spatial and narrative aspects they're based on. The spatial aspects of these connections can be conceptualized as pairing and registration, which each refer to how the virtual and the real are matched to form an augmented narrative space and how they're technologically aligned. The narrative aspects are function, which is the role that the virtual narrative space plays when it is paired with the real space, and placement rule, which concerns how the spatial arrangement of virtual narrative elements in the real space are determined. However, these connections have never been examined in detail in the context of augmented narrative spaces for AR storytelling. For this reason, we ask 2 questions. First, how have virtual narrative spaces been paired, registered, functionalized, and placed with regard to their target real spaces for the design of augmented narrative spaces in HCI, AR, and MR research? Second, based on the ways in which virtual narrative spaces have been connected to their target real spaces, what dominant types of augmented narrative spaces can be identified? To answer these questions, we conducted a systematic literature review of related research in the HCI, AR, and MR domains from the past 20 years. We adhered to the PRISMA statement for a standardized process, targeting top academic journals and conferences. After test trials, we finalized our search terms and applied a manual elimination process based on 3 inclusion and exclusion principles. Through this process, we were able to finalize 64 articles as our data for analysis. An article was included or excluded only when a unanimous decision was reached, and all authors contributed equally to the procedure. We applied grounded theory and utilized Brown and Clark's 6 stages of thematic analysis for multiple readings of the articles. Next, we corroborated the initial codes to examine common elements, terms, and descriptions concerning our 4 criteria, which emerged as potential patterns. We cross-reviewed these patterns by engaging in discussion to deliberate those that could best categorize the data for each criterion. Last, we organized the data to report the patterns that emerged. The patterns we found for pairing were exclusive, universal, and conditional. In exclusive pairings, the virtual narrative space is overlaid on a single, designated real space, whereas it can be matched with any real space for universal pairings. Conditional pairings are formed when the virtual narrative space is overlaid on certain real spaces with one or more specified attributes. For registration, spatial mapping, multiple anchoring, and single anchoring were identified. When the entire spatial range of the virtual narrative space is layered over the real space, it is labeled as spatial mapping. Multiple and single anchoring refer to when augmentations in the virtual narrative space are registered to either multiple or single specific points in the real space. Regarding function, virtual narrative spaces that reinforce complement features currently inherent in the real space. Those that represent past events and memories are categorized as remembering. And virtual narrative spaces that bear no relevance to the past and present features of the real space reskin it. In terms of placement, augmentations in the virtual narrative space are either positioned according to the geometric and geographic features of the real space or by their relevance to the function, meaning, and affordances of those physical features in the real space. Once we identified patterns for pairing and registrations as connections between spatial aspects of the virtual narrative space and real space, along with function and placement rule as those between narrative aspects of the two spaces, we linked the patterns found for these 4 connections in all 64 articles and visualized the data in an alluvial diagram. The alluvial diagram depicts prevailing tendencies for virtual real connections that can collectively define and distinguish different categories of augmented narrative spaces. Consequently, we confirmed 8 dominant links between the virtual real connections. Dominant links were defined as those consisting of more than 5% of the total number of articles. These 8 links accounted for 57 of the 64 articles reviewed. Furthermore, we found that they could be placed in 2 subsuming categories of augmented narrative spaces, which are spaces of virtually narrativized reality and spaces of realized virtual narratives. The first type of augmented narrative space that virtually narrativizes reality is historicized outdoor spaces. They are exclusively paired with the target real space, and the stories they tell are most often on the history of the real space, overlaying virtual narrative elements onto specific landmarks and locations. Anchoring points serve as story nodes in outdoor areas of singular, socially recognized identities. Enhanced indoor spaces are distinguished from historicized outdoor spaces by function and target real space, as they reinforce the present state of planned indoor layouts such as museum exhibition halls. This means that the narrative setting is provided by present configurations or inherent semantic attributes of the real space. Anchoring points are augmented with narrative elements, forming distinct sub-areas for continuous narrative experiences. For extended object spaces, registration is the sole factor that differentiates this type from enhanced indoor spaces. Units of the virtual narrative space are overlaid on a single object, regardless of how they're spatially and temporally arranged. Most cases targeted 2D image boards with unique designs that signify a specific space. In other cases, scenes related to the content of certain books were augmented on their pages or featured larger physical objects. Flexible backdrop spaces are characterized by conditional pairings that target a wide variety of real spaces. What sets them apart from other types in the broader category is that the narrative setting is less concrete. The characteristics of the anchoring points are viewed more as abstract ideas that loosely influence the construction and content of the virtual narrative space. Therefore, engagement with the narrative setting in the target real space occurs on a more symbolic or metaphorical level. This results in stories that are more context-driven than context-specific. Turning to spaces of realized virtual narratives, where the virtual narrative space takes precedence over the real space, the narrative elements of transported scene-based spaces are enclosed within the virtual space and are brought into the real space through multiple augmentation points. These augmentation points serve as the setting for scenes that facilitate narrative progression in varied spatial environments, ranges, and linearity. In transformed room-scale spaces, the virtual narrative space as a whole reskins reality by providing a story that is completely disassociated with the target real space. For example, any room can become a galaxy of planets to be conquered in an AR first-person shooting game called StarTag. Transplanted tabletop spaces are different from transported scene-based spaces and transformed room-scale spaces in their registration only. The augmented narrative spaces for this type register virtual narrative spaces to the real target space through a single marker, image, or location, which is not associated with the story in any meaningful way. Cases that fall under this type all presented augmented narrative spaces that target empty tabletop spaces as their real spatial range. The virtual narrative spaces augmented on them commonly provided content for interactive board games that users engage in through virtual agents at a miniature scale. The last type of realized virtual narratives are compatible portal spaces. In these cases, the real objects and locations to which the virtual narrative space was registered were interchangeable with others that shared the specified attributes. Moreover, these elements functioned as portals through which a virtual narrative space bearing no relevance to the target real space could spatially manifest. In analyzing the results, we first addressed RQ1 by discussing the spatial and narrative associations between virtual real connections. Regarding links between pairing and function, exclusive pairings are most common, indicating that target real spaces are largely fixed to be reinforced or remembered. Universal pairings mostly involve reskinning, while conditional ones are distributed between reskinning and reinforcing stories. Additionally, the placement of virtual narrative elements are determined by pairing and function. Second, we compare the 8 augmented narrative space types in terms of the spatial and narrative experiences they provide, with regard to RQ2. Of spaces that virtually narrativize reality, extended object spaces confine users to their immediate, tangible reality, while historicized outdoor spaces and enhanced indoor spaces move the user along spatial and narrative trajectories within a larger area. Compared with the 3 other space types, flexible backdrop spaces virtually narrativize reality more indirectly and metaphorically. Turning to spaces of realized virtual narratives, compatible portal spaces leverage certain traits that can be found across various real spaces to lead the user into virtual narrative spaces through them. This allows users to evade their surroundings while being situated in them. For the 3 other space types in this category, the distinction between them is made by how each type registers the virtual narrative space to the target space, as other connections are the same. This leads to differences in the spatial scale of the narratives being realized to some extent, which is in turn associated with the type of stories being told. Based on our analysis, we present design recommendations to leverage these virtual real connections and types of augmented narrative spaces to establish a more systematic approach to AR storytelling. The first is to strategize based on priority, the virtual or the real. If the virtual should be more prominent, stories of creative versatility can be adapted to a diverse range of real spaces via their physical features to showcase the transformative power of the virtual narrative space. If the focus is instead on bringing a certain real space to the fore, the virtual narrative space can recede to the background through a story that illuminates the hidden or apparent features of the real space. Second, consider narrative tropes against augmented narrative space types. Once the main objective for the design of an augmented narrative space is set, outlining the specifics of the narrative itself through parameters such as genre, character, sequence, and the degree of linearity to constitute certain narrative tropes for that objective is required, before it can be spatialized in the virtual and the real. Third, balance the virtual and the real through spatial user interaction. Our analysis revealed that according to an augmented narrative space's main objective and links between virtual-real connections, the composition of virtual and real elements differed in their amount and presence. Dominantly virtual spaces are more noticeably virtual, and real ones more real. However, it is crucial for users to perceive a balanced integration of the virtual and the real to enhance their immersion during an AR narrative experience. To mitigate the inevitable imbalance between the virtual and the real in certain types of augmented narrative spaces, we recommend facilitating user interaction with the less dominant elements as part of the design strategy. In conclusion, the design of augmented narrative spaces is fundamentally shaped by how connections between the virtual and the real define, support, and leverage the degree of dominance of one spatial entity over the other. Therefore, understanding of such connections in 8 dominant augmented narrative space types will contribute to a more structured approach to AR storytelling.